9 weeks before anyone knocked on her door, Verena Holt was already paying the price for a decision nobody understood. A wagon, weighed down by its heavy load, crept slowly along the main street of Milk River Breaks. Resting on the wagon was a solid cast-iron stove weighing nearly 250 pounds. Mud clung stubbornly to the wheels. People stopped what they were doing to watch. Some simply stared. Some shook their heads. One man laughed out loud. A widow with 2 children, he said, had no business hauling that much iron across the prairie. Verena heard him. So did Clara. So did little Noah. The stove kept moving. The laughter stayed behind. What nobody knew that September afternoon was that winter had already begun making a list, and that stove would answer a question the entire valley thought it already understood. Before she ever reached this valley, Verena Holt had already buried one future. Her husband, Caleb Holt, died of pneumonia during the spring of 1886. What remained behind was a rented house on the Dakota line, 2 children, and a stack of bills that did not care about grief. The landlord wanted another season's payment before winter. Verena did not have it. What she did have was a small homestead claim Caleb had filed months earlier in a place called Milk River Breaks. The cabin standing there was unfinished. The soil was stubborn. The nearest help was farther away than comfort. Yet if she could survive one winter on that claim, the land could belong to Clara and Noah someday. That possibility was worth more than the house she was leaving behind. The stove that drew so much laughter in town was not something Verena had recently purchased. It had belonged to Caleb's family for years. His father bought it after a terrible winter when a cheap sheet iron stove burned hot until midnight, then died before dawn. Frost crept across the cabin before morning. The lesson stayed with the family long after the snow melted. Caleb often repeated the same line. A stove that quits before dawn is only a lantern with a door. After his death, several people advised Verena to sell the heavy cast-iron stove. The money could have bought flour, boots for Clara, cloth for repairs, enough salt pork to ease a difficult season. Instead, Verena sold her last milk cow. She left her mother's rocking chair behind. Part of Caleb's tool chest stayed in Dakota. Even some of the children's books were packed away and surrendered. The stove remained. At 3 o'clock in the morning, when winter reached its coldest hour, memories could not warm a cabin. 2 sleeping children would need something stronger than that. The stove sitting on Verena Holt's wagon was not the kind most frontier families bought. A common sheet iron box stove could heat a room quickly. It could also lose that heat just as quickly once the fire burned down. This one worked differently. Its black cast iron body was thick and heavy. The mica window on the loading door had long since darkened with smoke. A narrow crack ran through one of the fire bricks inside. Years of use had left marks everywhere except on the lesson it carried. Nearly 250 pounds of cast iron made hauling miserable. That same weight made winter easier. Cast iron absorbed heat slowly, then released it slowly. A base burner pushed hot gases through a longer route before they reached the flue. Instead of rushing straight up the chimney, warmth spent more time inside the stove, more time inside the house, and more time doing useful work. The people of Milk River Breaks saw the situation differently. They saw overloaded wagon springs. They saw tired horses. They saw transportation costs. Most of all, they saw a widow spending precious resources on something difficult to move. To them, the stove looked like a burden. To Verena, it looked like stored time. A good fire could warm a cabin for an hour. Retained heat could carry a family through the coldest part of the night. That distinction mattered. Explaining it in September would have changed nothing. The valley was still enjoying mild afternoons and open roads. Winter remained a distant idea, not an immediate problem. So Verena said very little. She had learned something years earlier while listening to frontier men argue over tools, crops, and weather. People rarely understand a stove when it is working. Understanding usually arrives after a stove fails. By then, the lesson costs much more. Getting the stove to Milk River Breaks took longer than Verena Holt had planned. The wagon carrying it was already old when Caleb was alive. Under the weight of the cast-iron stove, the wagon bed sagged noticeably between the axles. On softer stretches of ground near the coulee, the wheels sank almost 4 inches into the mud. The horses worked hard for every mile. About every 3 miles, Verena stopped to let them breathe. She checked the harness. She checked the wheels. Then she checked the stove. A broken wagon would leave her stranded. A shifted load could kill a horse. Neither mistake was affordable. When the road climbed a clay ridge, Clara and Noah climbed down and walked. Verena stayed beside the wagon, one hand on the side rail, carefully watching how the weight settled across the rear axle. Late that afternoon, the team reached the main street near the general store. The wagon hit a patch of crusted mud and lurched. Verena reacted immediately. She slid a wooden wedge beneath one wheel before it could sink deeper. A rawhide rope was tightened around the crate to stop any shifting. While she worked, she told Clara to keep Noah away from the wheels. Several men watched from the hitching rail. None moved. Among them stood Elias Rusk. As the valley's most seasoned freight hauler, Elias knew every trail and judged everything by cost, distance, and weight. To a practical man like him, a broke widow pouring money into a massive, useless object was absurd. One look at the oversized iron stove was enough to make him laugh. "That stove will eat more than it heats." The remark traveled quickly through the group. A few men laughed with him. Across the street, storekeeper Miriam Bell glanced through the window. She did not join the laughter. She did not step outside either. Verena continued working. The rope tightened. The wedge held. The wagon steadied. Only then did she rise to her feet. Beside her, Clara stared at the ground. Noah looked from one face to another. Why won't they help? The question hung in the air for a moment. Verena finished checking the wheel. Then she looked toward her daughter. "Hold your brother's hand." The wagon started moving again. Behind her, the laughter faded. Ahead of her, winter waited. By the time Verena Holt reached her claim, the sun had already dropped behind the western ridges. The trip was over. The difficult part was not. The cast-iron stove still sat on the wagon. No neighbor appeared on horseback. No wagon followed her home. The men who had watched in town stayed in town. That left Verena with a problem weighing nearly 250 pounds. Fortunately, weight could be negotiated with. She gathered the tools Caleb had once trusted: an old block and tackle, 2 cottonwood skids, a rusted length of chain, and 3 wooden wedges worn smooth by years of use. Near the cabin stood 2 weathered posts left by whoever had abandoned the claim before Caleb filed for it. Verena lashed a crossbeam between them and hung the pulley overhead. The work began slowly, a few inches, then stop, another few inches, then stop again. Clara held a lantern as daylight faded. Noah's job was simpler. Whenever Verena called out, he counted. The rhythm helped everyone stay focused. The children lacked the strength to move the stove, but they could help keep the work orderly. For nearly an hour, the stove crept downward. Then the rope slipped. The load shifted suddenly. One corner dropped. A wagon board groaned. The sound echoed through the evening air. Verena reacted before panic could. She jammed a wedge beneath the low side, secured the chain, then studied the angle of the pull. The rope had been fighting gravity directly. She rerouted it diagonally. The resistance changed immediately. The stove settled. Control returned. Darkness arrived before the job ended. By the time the stove finally touched the cottonwood skids, the skin across several knuckles had split open from friction. Still, the wagon remained intact. The stove remained intact. Most importantly, Clara and Noah had never stepped inside the danger zone. That night, the stove stayed outside the cabin, resting on the skids beside the doorway. It looked almost alive, like a patient iron animal waiting for permission to cross the threshold. The following morning brought a different kind of visitor. Jonah Creed, the settlement's blacksmith and stove repairman, rode out after hearing about the enormous cast-iron stove sitting beside Verena Holt's cabin. Unlike Elias Rusk, Jonah never laughed. Metal had taught him too many lessons for that. He walked around the stove slowly. His eyes moved from the flue pipe to the cabin wall, from the cabin wall to the plank floor, then back to the stove again. After several minutes, he rubbed a thumb across the cast iron and frowned. Big stove for a small cabin. Verena continued unpacking supplies. Jonah crouched beside the firebox and examined the cracked fire brick liner. "A base burner likes steady draft," he said. "Give it the wrong flue, a loose collar, a leaking door seal, or a bad hearth placement, and it'll never behave right." His finger tapped the cracked brick. Heavy iron does not forgive bad fitting. The warning carried more weight than anything Elias had said in town. Elias understood freight. Jonah understood heat. That made him harder to dismiss. Verena did not argue. She did not claim the stove would solve every problem. Instead, she asked a question. "You got any old stove rope?" Jonah looked up. "Got some scraps. Enough to use? Maybe. Pretty?" That caught him off guard. The blacksmith gave a short laugh. "Not even close." Verena nodded toward the stove. "Pretty doesn't stop a draft." Her gaze shifted to the cabin wall. "Height does." For the first time that morning, Jonah studied her a little differently. Most people talked about stoves as objects. Verena talked about them as systems. A few minutes later, he returned to his horse, dug through a saddlebag, and handed her a worn coil of stove rope. The material looked rough. Parts of it were stained black from years of use. Jonah hesitated before letting go. He still believed the stove might be too much for the cabin. He still believed several things could go wrong. Yet he also knew enough about winter to recognize preparation when he saw it. Whether he was helping Verena succeed or helping her make an expensive mistake remained to be seen. The coming cold would decide that soon enough. Moving the stove into the cabin took another 2 days. Waite behaved differently indoors. Out on the trail, the challenge had been distance. Inside the cabin, every inch mattered. Verena Holt removed the front door from its hinges to gain a few extra inches of clearance. She spread old sackcloth beneath the skids to reduce friction across the floor. Smooth river stones collected from the nearby river bottom became temporary bearing points, allowing the stove to roll forward a little at a time. The process never looked dramatic. It looked patient. Pull, adjust, check the angle, pull again. Slowly, the massive stove crossed the threshold and entered the cabin. Verena guided it toward the northeast corner. That side received less direct wind during most winter storms. Less draft meant less wasted heat. Location mattered. Everything mattered. She refused to place the stove directly against the log wall. Instead, she built a backing from flat river stones bonded together with clay slip. The stone barrier would absorb heat and reduce the risk of scorching the logs during long burns. A proper hearth came next. More flat stones were fitted together above the plank floor, raised slightly so stray embers and ash could not slip into the cracks between boards. As the work continued, Clara paid attention to every detail. She watched where kindling would be stored. She noticed where larger wood would be stacked. Years later, she would still remember those decisions. Near sunset, Noah wandered close to the stove and placed a hand against the cold iron. The metal felt lifeless, almost disappointing. He looked up at his mother. "Will it stay warm all night?" Verena paused before answering. The question deserved honesty. Her eyes moved from the stove to the stone backing, then toward the unfinished wood rack she planned to build next. "If we do our part." The answer carried more truth than Noah understood. The stove alone could not guarantee survival. Neither could skill, nor preparation. Winter demanded cooperation between all of them. The tool, the person using it, the cabin surrounding it, and the weather waiting outside. By the middle of October, Verena Holt finally counted her winter fuel. 1 cord and 3/4. Enough to feel hopeful on a warm afternoon, not enough to feel comfortable when January arrived. In her mind, 2.5 cords would have been safer, maybe more. The problem was money. The last milk cow was gone. Part of the moving costs had gone to hauling the stove. Flour had to be bought. Salt had to be bought. A better section of stovepipe had to be bought. Even the old stove rope from Jonah Creed needed a few additions before it could be trusted. Verena could not make winter shorter. She could not make fuel cheaper. What remained under her control was efficiency. Every piece of wood received a purpose. Dry cottonwood was stacked closest to the stove because it caught fire quickly. The heavier ash splits went into a separate pile. Those pieces burned slower and left stronger coal beds behind. Small kindling stayed in boxes where Clara could reach it without opening the firebox door for long periods. Heat escaped every time a stove door opened. Even small habits mattered. Most settlers stored nearly all their fuel outside. Verena chose a different arrangement. A small indoor wood bay appeared beside the stove. It held enough fuel for more than a full day of burning. The stack looked unusual. It also took up valuable space inside a small cabin. One afternoon, Elias Rusk rode past and noticed it through the open doorway. He slowed his horse and laughed. "Keep hauling wood indoors like that and the mice will own the place before Christmas." Verena continued stacking fuel. The answer remained the same as it had been in town. Silence. Elias rode away convinced he had spotted another foolish decision. Inside the cabin, Clara studied the wood bay for a moment. Then she looked at her mother. The pile seemed strange, maybe even excessive. Yet she was beginning to notice a pattern. Whenever something looked unnecessary to other people, Verena usually had a reason for it. The valley still saw firewood as a quantity. Verena saw it as access. Those were not always the same thing. By late October, Verena Holt decided it was time for a full overnight test. Winter had not arrived yet. That was exactly why the test mattered. Mistakes discovered in October could still be fixed. Mistakes discovered in January often became stories people stopped telling because nobody survived to finish them. The first evening seemed promising. The cast iron warmed slowly, just as it was supposed to. Heat spread through the cabin without sharp swings. The stone backing behind the stove gradually absorbed warmth and began giving some of it back. By bedtime, the cabin felt comfortable. Clara fell asleep early. Noah followed soon afterward. For several hours, everything appeared to be working. Then, sometime around 3 in the morning, Verena opened her eyes. A faint sound had awakened her, Noah turning beneath his blanket. Nothing more. The stove was still warm. The room still held heat. Yet something felt wrong. Lantern light revealed what darkness had hidden. The children's corner was cooler than the rest of the cabin, not dramatically, just enough to matter. Verena crouched beside the floorboards and held a hand near the hearth. A thin current of cold air brushed across her knuckles. The draft was so narrow it felt almost like a thread sliding through the darkness. She followed it to the gap where the hearthstones met the wooden floor. A second clue waited near the flue collar, a faint line of soot. Small, easy to miss, evidence nonetheless. Jonah Creed had been right. Heavy iron could not compensate for poor fitting. The discovery did not discourage her. Verena never expected the first version of anything to be perfect. What she saw was not failure. It was information. Morning brought a bucket of clay slip, a pan of fine ash, and several hours of careful work. The mixture filled tiny gaps around the hearth. Additional stove rope tightened the seal around the firebox door. A few flat stones were repositioned where heat escaped too quickly. Near the rear of the stove, a small sheet of tin altered the airflow and reflected warmth back toward the living space. None of the changes looked impressive. Most visitors would never notice them. That was the nature of useful corrections. The best ones often disappeared into the system itself. By afternoon, the cabin looked almost unchanged. Verena knew better. A cold draft had shown her where the weakness lived. Now she intended to make it harder for Winter to find. A few days later, Jonah Creed returned. The blacksmith had not come to socialize. Curiosity had brought him. The changes Verena Holt made after the overnight test interested him more than he cared to admit. He stepped inside and immediately noticed the repairs. The clay slip around the hearth seam had dried into place. The worn stove rope sat neatly packed around the firebox door. The flue collar no longer showed signs of leakage. Even the small sheet of tin behind the stove remained exactly where Verena had positioned it. Nothing looked accidental. Jonah walked slowly around the installation. Then he reached into a coat pocket and pulled out a length of cotton thread. Verena watched without speaking. The blacksmith tied one end to a nail near the hearth and let the thread hang freely. Several days earlier, a draft had been strong enough to make a similar thread tremble. Now it barely moved. A faint sway. Nothing more. The gap had been found. The gap had been closed. Jonah studied it for a while. Finally, he nodded once. That will hold better. Verena looked up from the wood she was sorting. Better than what? The question lingered longer than either expected. Through the cabin window, the settlement sat beneath a pale autumn sky. Far beyond the claim stood Jonah's own house. Inside it was a lighter box stove he had trusted for years. His eyes drifted in that direction before returning to the thread. When he answered, his voice stayed quiet. Better than most. The words were not a surrender. They were not an endorsement either. Jonah still believed the cast-iron stove carried risks. He still thought the weight had complicated Verena's life. Yet the evidence hanging in front of him refused to cooperate with his doubts. The draft leak was gone. The heat stayed where it belonged. For the first time, he began to suspect that Verena had not hauled an oversized stove across the prairie. She had been building a system. The distinction was small enough to miss. Winter rarely missed it. While Verena Holt sealed tiny gaps and adjusted details most people would never notice, the rest of Milk River Breaks prepared for winter the way it always had. Habit carried a great deal of authority on the frontier. Many cabins still relied on lightweight sheet iron box stoves. They heated a room quickly, glowed brightly for a few hours, and demanded attention long before sunrise. Nobody considered that unusual. People simply accepted it. Wood piles rose beside cabins throughout the settlement. Freshly split cottonwood stacked neatly against walls became a source of quiet pride. The larger the pile, the safer a family felt. At least that was the common belief. Inside the general store, Miriam Bell filled page after page in her ledger. Flour, salt pork, lamp oil, axe handles. The usual purchases continued. Very few customers asked about stove rope. Even fewer wanted replacement firebrick or flue collars. When Jonah Creed occasionally suggested checking chimney connections before winter arrived, most people dismissed the advice with a shrug. Cold weather came every year. They had managed before. Why should this year be different? Elias Rusk felt especially confident. Beside his house stood a cottonwood pile nearly as tall as the lower edge of a window. Most of it remained fully exposed to the weather. He saw abundance. Verena would have seen vulnerability. The difference mattered. One afternoon, Clara overheard several adults laughing about the stove again while visiting the store. The sound felt different now. A few weeks earlier, she would have lowered her eyes and waited for the conversation to end. This time she simply listened. Then she glanced toward the distant claim where the small indoor wood bay sat beside the cast-iron stove. She could not explain heat retention. She could not explain draft control. Much of the technical reasoning still escaped her. What she understood was simpler. Her mother kept preparing for something other people had not yet decided to imagine, and so far, every strange decision seemed connected to the next one. By the end of November, Milk River Breaks began to change. The change arrived so quietly that most people never noticed it. There were no howling winds, no heavy clouds rolling across the prairie, no early blizzards sweeping down from the north. The valley simply grew still. Smoke rising from several chimneys no longer climbed into the sky. Instead, it drifted low across the ground before dissolving into the cold afternoon air. Frost appeared on fence wire long before sunset. White crystals formed where they had no business forming. Even the animals seemed unsettled. Verena Holt noticed her horses first. For nearly an entire morning, both stood with their hindquarters facing north. They barely moved. They simply held their position as though bracing for something still beyond the horizon. The cattle belonging to the Pike family, longtime ranchers in Milk River Breaks, behaved strangely as well. Rather than grazing along the ridge, they gathered inside a sheltered draw and refused to leave it. Most people dismissed the signs. Verena did not. One afternoon she stepped outside and placed a hand against the metal door latch. The cold startled her. The iron seemed to be pulling heat from her skin faster than it should. She stood there for several seconds, studying the sky. Then she looked toward the woodpile. Without a word, she pointed toward the indoor wood bay. "Bring in 2 more armloads of ash." Clara nodded and started carrying wood. Noah followed behind her. Halfway through the task, he glanced toward the horizon. "Is a storm coming?" Verena considered the question. The answer felt larger than weather. Her eyes returned to the strange stillness hanging over the valley. Something is making up its mind. The words stayed with the children. Inside the settlement, life continued as usual. Outside the settlement, the prairie continued gathering evidence. Nature never announced its verdicts. It preferred smaller signals. People who recognized those clues gained time. People who ignored them gained confidence. For a little while, both groups believed they were making the smarter choice. The difference between them would soon become impossible to miss. The ice storm arrived shortly after midnight during the first week of December. It did not arrive like a blizzard. The storm chose a quieter method. A fine, freezing rain began falling onto a landscape already trapped below zero. Drop after drop touched the world and hardened. Fence wire disappeared beneath a clear coating of ice. Axe handles disappeared. Door latches disappeared. Wagon wheels disappeared. Every surface slowly vanished beneath a shell of glass. By sunrise, nearly 3/8 of an inch of ice covered the valley. The layer was thinner than a heavy snowfall. It was also far more difficult to fight. The temperature plunged to 31 degrees below zero. Strangely, the wind remained almost absent. That silence made the storm feel worse. Without roaring gusts or flying snow, there was no obvious warning. People stepped outside believing they still controlled their supplies. Then they discovered they did not. Cabin doors resisted opening. Tools froze where they hung. The wood was still there. Access was gone. A stack of firewood locked beneath ice remained a stack of firewood only in appearance. The fence wire no longer moved. Cottonwood branches stood motionless against the gray sky, weighted down until they resembled glass sculptures. Across the settlement, families began discovering the difference between ownership and availability. Verena Holt had been awake long before dawn, listening quietly. Outside, tiny sounds drifted from the roof, sharp, delicate. Each one sounded like a sewing needle touching a tin plate. Ice was building, layer by layer, minute by minute. Nothing about her preparation looked dramatic. Neither did the consequences. Across Milk River Breaks, dozens of ordinary decisions were about to face the same judge. Nature had finished gathering evidence. Now, it was beginning to deliver its verdict. Inside Verena Holt's cabin, the storm met resistance. The cast-iron base burner never rushed. That was part of its strength. Before dawn, Verena fed the fire with dry cottonwood. The wood caught quickly and rebuilt the coal bed left from the night before. Once the fire settled, heavier ash splits followed. Those pieces were not chosen for speed. They were chosen because they lasted. The damper remained carefully adjusted. Too much air would waste fuel. Too little would smother the fire. Years earlier, Caleb Holt had taught her how to bank coals for a long burn. The fire needed room to breathe, but only enough to stay alive. By 8 o'clock that morning, the cabin was far from warm in the way people imagined comfort. It was something better. It was stable. The stone backing behind the stove held heat. The repaired hearth no longer leaked cold air across the floor. Clara climbed out of bed without pulling the blanket over her head. Nearby, Noah rubbed his cheeks and smiled. My face doesn't hurt anymore. Outside, the temperature continued falling. Across the settlement, Elias Rusk fought a different battle. His sheet iron box stove roared through fuel from first light onward. Flames burned brightly. Heat filled the room. For a while, the system appeared successful. Near midday, the fuel stored indoors ran out. Elias grabbed his coat and headed for the woodpile. The door latch resisted him. Ice had sealed it in place. By the time he forced the door open, valuable heat escaped into the frozen air. The woodpile stood exactly where he had left it. The storm had changed its nature. A layer of ice bound the stack together so completely that individual pieces no longer separated cleanly. Elias swung an axe. The blade bounced. He swung again. A sharp crack followed. The wooden handle split near the eye. By 1:40 that afternoon, the box stove contained little more than fading embers. Soon afterward, even those disappeared. Cold iron replaced heat. A thin skin of ice formed across the water basin near the wall. The room grew quieter. Elias walked to the window. Across the white distance between claims, one chimney still released a steady ribbon of smoke into the gray sky. He stared at it for a long time. The sight no longer resembled a neighbor's chimney. It looked more like an answer. By late afternoon, Elias Rusk understood that pride had become a luxury. Heat came first. The distance between his cabin and Verena Holt's claim was less than 70 yards. Under normal conditions, a man could cross it in a minute. The ice storm had changed the meaning of distance. Every step threatened to send him sprawling onto glass-hard ground. Twice he slipped. The third time, he caught himself with both hands and stayed there for a moment, breathing heavily. After that, walking stopped making sense. He moved the rest of the way in short, awkward stretches, sometimes on his feet, sometimes on his knees, occasionally using a fence post or buried rock for balance. The cold punished every delay. By the time Verena's cabin came into view, frost clung to the edges of his scarf. His face had gone pale, his hands barely obeyed him. Inside the cabin, Clara heard the sound first. A faint knock, so soft it almost disappeared beneath the crackle of the stove. She looked toward the door, then toward her mother. Verena already knew. Hours earlier, she had noticed the absence of smoke above Elias's cabin. The chimney had gone silent. That fact had been sitting quietly in the back of her mind ever since. When she opened the door, Elias stood on the porch, shivering beneath two coats. Embarrassment sat on him almost as heavily as the cold. For a brief moment, old memories returned. The general store, the laughter, Noah asking why nobody helped, Clara staring at the ground. The memories passed as quickly as they arrived. Something behind Elias demanded attention. Martha Pike stood several yards away with a coughing child wrapped in blankets. Samuel Pike dragged two younger children across the ice on a feed sack. Farther back stood Lorna Vale, a woman holding a claim alone. She held a jar of chokecherry preserves against her coat as though carrying an offering she could not quite explain. Nobody asked for forgiveness. Nobody tried to justify the past. The storm had stripped away those conversations. Verena opened the door wider. Warm air rolled onto the porch. Come in before the floor takes your feet. One by one, they crossed the threshold. What greeted them was not wealth. The cabin contained no expensive furniture, no spare rooms, no signs of abundance. What it did contain was order. The indoor wood bay stood beside the stove exactly where it could be reached without opening the door. The stone backing behind the cast iron still held warmth from hours earlier. The repaired hearth remained tight. Nothing inside the room felt accidental. The base burner occupied its corner quietly, almost as if it had never cared whether anyone approved of it. Elias Rusk settled onto a stool near the stove and removed his gloves. His eyes drifted toward the firebox. Beneath a layer of pale ash, the coal bed still glowed. The heat did not roar. It endured. Small pockets of orange light pulsed gently in the darkness, breathing at their own steady pace. A few hours earlier, his own stove had died. This one seemed to understand patience. Later that evening, Jonah Creed arrived. The blacksmith had spent much of the day helping another family break apart a frozen woodpile. His hands were stiff from the effort. After entering the cabin, he immediately noticed the cotton thread hanging near the hearth. It remained nearly motionless. The flue collar showed no fresh soot. The repairs had held. Jonah said nothing. He simply stood there longer than necessary, studying details most people would never notice. As night settled over the valley, Verena fed several ash splits into the stove around 6:40. Near 11:15, She banked the coals and adjusted the damper. At 3:30 in the morning, she rose again, added 2 more heavy splits, and returned to bed. The routine required only minutes. That was the point. Throughout the night, 11 people rested inside the cabin in shifts of sleep and wakefulness. Children dozed beneath blankets. Adults sat quietly near the walls. Lorna Vale eventually placed her jar of chokecherry preserves on the table beside the lantern. Nobody explained why. Nobody asked her to. The stove that had once drawn laughter from across the settlement now warmed the very people who had watched it pass. Around the room, conversation came and went. One thing never returned: the laughter. 36 hours after the storm arrived, the valley began releasing its grip. The change happened gradually. First came a faint snap somewhere along a fence line. Later, a cottonwood branch shed part of its icy burden and dropped toward the ground. By afternoon, water dripped from the lean-to roof in slow, uneven intervals, like a clock relearning how to keep time. The temperature climbed 12 degrees within a few hours. That was enough. Wood piles across the settlement slowly separated from the glass shells surrounding them. Doors opened more easily. Tools became usable again. Families returned to their own claims. Most left Verena Holt's cabin more quietly than they had entered it. The crisis was ending. The lesson remained. Back at home, box stoves burned hard as people worked to recover lost warmth. Yet something had changed. The familiar crackle of those fires no longer sounded quite as convincing. Nobody called a meeting. Nobody stood in front of the general store and announced that Verena had been right. Milk River Breaks was not built that way. 2 mornings later, Verena stepped outside before sunrise and found a new stack of wood beside the lean-to. 2 full cords of split ash, neatly stacked, carefully cut. There was no note, no signature, no attempt to claim credit. But the fresh runner marks in the snow told her everything she needed to know. She stood there for a moment, studying them before returning to her chores. Spring eventually brought new entries to Miriam Bell's ledger: stove rope, pipe collars, fire brick, orders for cast iron stoves. Jonah Creed changed as well. He began inspecting flue seams before problems appeared instead of waiting to repair damage afterward. The settlement learned slowly. Frontier communities often did. Still, the changes spread. Not through speeches or arguments. People simply started doing things differently. Sometimes that is how the strongest lessons travel. They move quietly from one pair of hands to another until nobody remembers exactly when the change began. Verena Holt stayed in Milk River Breaks. The following summer, she expanded the indoor wood bay beside the stove. More river stone was added behind the cast iron. The heat corner that had carried her family through the ice storm became stronger, steadier, and easier to manage. Life settled into seasons. Clara learned how to bank coals without smothering them. She learned how to read the color of a coal bed and how to listen for the difference between a healthy draft and a struggling one. Noah learned other lessons. Years later, he would still remember the sound of ice striking the lean-to roof during that storm. He would remember waking before dawn and seeing his mother crouched near the hearth, searching for cold air with the back of her hand. Children remember strange things. Sometimes they remember the exact moment wisdom becomes visible. The base burner remained in that corner of the cabin for another 19 years. Over time, it stopped feeling like a possession. Nobody thought of it as cargo anymore. It belonged to the house in the same way the sill logs belonged to the house, the same way the door latch belonged to the house, the same way a polished handrail belongs to every hand that has touched it. When Clara married and left the claim, Verena gave her a fresh coil of stove rope. Along with it came a piece of advice. Not every house needs a big stove. Every house needs to know where the wind is traveling. Clara never forgot it. Years later, when Noah built his own cabin, he chose a smaller stove than the one his mother had hauled across the prairie. Even so, the hearth went in before the trim. An indoor wood bay existed before the shelves. The lesson had survived. That was the real inheritance. The frontier taught many people how to build a fire. Verena Holt learned something deeper. Heat is not simply something a stove creates. Heat is something a house manages to keep. Something a careful person learns to protect. Something nature fails to take away when preparation has been honest. Long before the ice storm arrived, Verena had made a decision that looked too heavy, too expensive, and too difficult to explain. Then she spent weeks dragging that decision through mud, inch by inch. When winter finally came to test every claim in the valley, the stove was ready. More importantly, so was the woman who had believed in it.